Hi there, I'm James Dapperchi, and this is Coffee and a Case Note. Team, today we're going to talk about an uncle and a nephew, but we're not going to use those words again. We're going to call them a plaintiff and a defendant. And as you and I both know very well, a plaintiff is a person who comes to court, who seeks certain orders, and a defendant is the sort of person who comes and resists the orders being sought. So what's going on here? We have our plaintiff and our defendant reach an oral agreement in about the mid-2010s to purchase some land. And the nature of the agreement is, hey, you and I are going to purchase some land, and what's going to happen is we're going to cause the defendant's company, the defendant operates a building company, to build a couple of dwellings on the land, to build a couple of swimming pools on the land, to subdivide the land such that plaintiff gets a house and a pool on their bit of land, and defendant gets a house and a pool on their bit of land. And so this plan sort of marches ahead. The defendant, through their building company, engages an architect to prepare some plans, then engages a quantity surveyor to look through and be like, all right, what's it going to cost to construct these sort of plans? And the defendant's building company issues a building contract to kind of say, look, having been to the QS, having looked at the plans, this is the number. It's about $985,000. We say it's $985, let's sign up. And the defendant company is poised to start the building work. Now there's some complexity with finance. One of the challenges the parties have is getting a financier interested in order to loan some money. There is some problems with the initial lenders engaged with. The defendant eventually sells their own home in order to get the financing process rolling. There are a number of things to step through. There's a second building contract issued for the same building work through this refinancing process, and essentially that reissue is designed to show serviceability of the loan, if that makes sense. So remember, the initial contract's $985, they draw up a new one for exactly the same work that the defendant building company goes, oh, no, we'll call it $860, and they sign up to that, and it is accepted in cross-examination that the purpose for the defendant causing their company to show that new contract is in order to show serviceability of the loan. So a lender will say, oh yeah, $860, that's okay. But in any case, there are these complications with financing the project as it goes along. Another complexity in relation to the progress of the development is that the defendant makes a change to the proposed plans. And in essence, what the defendant does is change the building materials to be used in the defendant's home in order to sort of increase the value of the defendant's home. So there's this material change to the plans and a material, we are left to infer, increase in the value in the defendant's home as the development progresses. Now in any case, the development does progress, there is further financing sought and there are complexities that arise there, but there is an occupation certificate issued, there is a subdivision that goes ahead, but there's no agreement reached between plaintiff and defendant about accounting. Right? Defendant saying how I've incurred these costs in relation to development. Plaintiff says, I've got no confidence that your building company didn't funnel off our money to other projects the defendant building company might have been pursuing. And through the process of the matter, the defendant building company is actually deregistered. And so the plaintiff has these queries, essentially saying, I don't know what your building company did with the money and I'm worried it funneled it off to other stuff. So as you might imagine, there's heads clashing. There's no agreement reached between plaintiff and defendant about this accounting process. How are we going to deal with the cost of this project? And so we come to this piece of litigation, right? It is the plaintiff coming to court seeking orders. The nature of the orders the plaintiff is seeking is for they indeed seek the appointment of a section 66G trustee, singular, and we'll get to the complexity of seeking a singular trustee in a moment. But they seek a trustee for sale, and what that person does, as you may well know, is sort of come in, become the legal owner of the property, sell it, deal with any costs of the sale, and then hand back the balance to the co-owners of the property. It's a way for kind of disputing co-owners to sort of end their relationship in their ownership status of a piece of property. So the plaintiff seeks that, and also seeks about $1 million in damages from the defendant to be paid out of the corpus of that trust. Now there's a cross-claim raised by the defendant for about $350,000 saying, oh, what about all these development costs that I've incurred? That should be paid out of the trust as well. And so we have the plaintiff on one side saying, get these independent trustees in and get me my money. And the defendant saying, I don't want the trustees in, and also I've got a cross-claim for this amount of money. Now what the defendant says, after the court works through the relevant law relating to section 66G statutory trustees, is the defendant says, this case is an example where 66G trustees should not be appointed because the plaintiff and I reached an oral agreement that says, hey, the outcome of all this is we're each going to be the owner of a house and a pool on a subdivided piece of land, and we're each going to agree to an accounting process. And that's our exit strategy. And because we've got an exit strategy in place, the effect of that, even though our contract doesn't say never appoint a 66G trustee or 66G trustees, the effect of that contract is, hey, we've got an exit strategy, and so the fact we have an exit strategy stands in the way of the appointment of 66G trustees. Now, the court is not attracted to that argument and eventually doesn't accept it. And the position is arrived at for two reasons. Firstly, do you remember that the defendant changed the nature of the construction of the building on their property? So the original agreement reached between plaintiff and defendant is we're going to build these two houses of the same value. The defendant changed the building material of their building and so changed the value of their building. And so the operation of the contract to stand in the way of 66G doesn't occur, the court finds, in the way the defendant argues. Flowing on from that, the court says, look, 66G is a section that operates to appoint trustees of sale almost as of right. It's not for the plaintiff to prove why they should get 66G trustees. It's for the defendant to show why the plaintiff should not, or why the parties should not get 66G trustees, and the defendant fails to illustrate that. And so we're then left with kind of the substance of the claim and like what are the orders going to look like. Firstly, there's a bit of like an administrative correction made to the way the plaintiff brought the application. The plaintiff sought the appointment of one trustee, one natural person trustee. And if you're seeking natural person 66G trustees, you've actually got to appoint at least two. And so there's a minor amendment made to deal with that. And the proposed remuneration that the plaintiff had in mind for their trustee or trustees now was overly generous. And so the court has to kind of tweak with that. That's all right. The court also deals with the cross-claim. Do you remember the defendant said, how about this $350,000 in costs? The court dismisses that cross-claim, off it goes. And so the court makes an order appointing the 66G trustees, dealing with costs to be paid out of the corpus of the trust, out of the kind of proceeds of the trustee for sale trust, and also says that there's going to be an accounting process to take place to deal with how the costs were apportioned between all the parties, left, right and centre. I hope that discussion assisted you, and I look forward to joining you again soon over another coffee and in respect of another case note. Cheers.